The sacks moved when the wind hit them. Thomas Hartwell squinted through the Montana dust at three small figures on the auction platform, burlap tied over their heads like they were heading for the gallows instead of new homes. The auctioneer's hammer gleamed in the harsh afternoon sun, and something about those hunched shoulders made Thomas's chest tighten with a memory he couldn't place. $50 takes all three. The auctioneer bellowed over the wind that rattled the trading post's loose boards. Labor-ready orphans, no questions asked. Thomas had come to town for supplies, not children. His logging camp sat 20 miles north in timber country, where the work broke men twice the size of these youngsters. But when the smallest figure swayed like a sapling in a storm, something deep in his gut twisted hard. Through the crowd of ranchers and drifters, he caught fragments of whispered speculation. Came off the morning stage from Fort Benton. Drivers said their folks died of fever. Probably better off wherever they end up. The burlap sacks bothered him most. What kind of people covered children's faces like livestock heading to slaughter? 45, called a voice from the back. Thomas had $47 in his pocket, meant for winter supplies and a new crosscut saw. His foreman, Jake, would skin him alive for bringing mouths to feed instead of tools to work with. The smart play was to walk away, buy his supplies, and get back to the timber before the first snow hit the high country. The middle child stumbled, and the largest one steadied them with a protective arm. 50. The words left Thomas's mouth before his brain caught up. Every eye in the crowd swung his way, measuring him against his bid. He was a big man, shoulders broad from years of swinging an axe, but not the kind who usually bought people at auctions. Sold to the Lumberjack, the auctioneer declared, his gavel striking wood with the finality of a coffin nail. Thomas pushed through the crowd, his boots heavy on the packed dirt. Up close, the children looked even smaller, their clothes travel-stained and threadbare. He handed over his money to a clerk, who smelled like whiskey and counted twice. "You want the sacks off?" the clerk asked. "I'll handle it," Thomas said. He loaded his unexpected cargo into his wagon, alongside sacks of flour and beans, noting how they huddled together on the rough wooden bed. The largest child kept one arm around each of the others, a gesture so familiar it made Thomas's throat close up. The ride to camp took 4 hours through country that grew wilder with each mile. Ponderosa pines climbed the mountain sides like green soldiers, and the air thinned until it cut sharp and clean through the lungs. Thomas had built his operation in a valley where Crow Creek ran fast and cold, perfect for floating logs downstream to the mill. His men were waiting when the wagon rolled into camp. Jake Morrison, his foreman, took one look at the covered figures and spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Tell me you didn't just buy slaves, Tom." "Orphans," Thomas said. "They needed help. This ain't a charity house. It's a logging operation." The other men gathered around the wagon, their faces showing everything from curiosity to outright hostility. Swede Larson cracked his knuckles. Big Mike O'Malley shook his head like Thomas had lost his mind. "Winter's coming," Jake continued. "We got barely enough food for the men we got." Thomas climbed down from the wagon and faced his crew. These were hard men who'd followed him through 3 seasons of dangerous work, and he owed them straight talk. "You're right. But they're here now, and they're staying." He reached for the nearest burlap sack, his hands surprisingly gentle for their size. The fabric was rough against his fingers, tied with coarse rope that had rubbed the child's neck raw. "Easy now," he murmured, working the knot loose. Nobody's going to hurt you. The sack came away to reveal a girl of maybe 10, her dark hair tangled and her eyes wide with fear. She blinked against the sudden light, then looked up at Thomas with an expression that stopped his heart cold. Those eyes, green as deep forest pools, with gold flecks that caught the afternoon sun. He'd seen those exact eyes every morning in his shaving mirror for 38 years. His hands shook as he moved to the second child, a boy a year or two older. The same bone structure, the same stubborn chin Thomas remembered from childhood photographs. When he freed the third child, the youngest girl, she smiled up at him with a gap-toothed grin that belonged to his sister Mary at age 7. The silence stretched like a bowstring until Jake cleared his throat. Jesus, Tom. They look just like... I know what they look like. Thomas knelt in the dirt so he was eye level with the children. The resemblance was impossible to ignore, but resemblance wasn't proof. Plenty of folks shared similar features without sharing blood. "What are your names?" he asked. The oldest boy straightened his shoulders, trying to look brave. "I'm Daniel. This is Ruth and that's Sarah. We don't need charity, mister. We can work." Daniel, Ruth, Sarah. The names hit Thomas like physical blows. His brother Daniel had run off to California in '49, chasing gold dreams and leaving nothing but a terse letter that said he'd found a woman and wouldn't be back. That was 15 years ago, before the war, before Thomas had given up hope of ever seeing his younger brother again. "Where did you come from?" Thomas managed. "Sacramento," Ruth said quietly. "Our pa died of the fever last month. Ma followed 2 weeks later." "Sacramento, California." The pieces aligned with terrible clarity. "What was your pa's name?" "Daniel Hartwell," Sarah piped up. "He used to tell us stories about his big brother up in Montana. Said his brother Thomas could fell a tree bigger than a house." The world tilted sideways. Thomas sat back hard in the dust, his vision blurring. These weren't just orphans he'd bought at auction. These were his brother's children, his nieces and nephew, sold like cattle because nobody knew they had family. "Pa said you probably thought he was dead," Daniel continued, his young voice carrying a weight no child should bear. "Said he wrote letters but never sent them because he was ashamed of how things turned out." Jake stepped closer, his earlier hostility forgotten. "Tom? You all right?" Thomas couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. He'd spent 15 years wondering if Daniel was alive, if he'd found the fortune he'd chased west. Now he knew his brother had lived and died, never knowing Thomas would have welcomed him home with open arms. "We can leave if you don't want us," Ruth said, misreading his silence. "We're used to taking care of ourselves." That broke through his paralysis. Thomas reached out and pulled all 3 children into his arms, not caring that his men were watching or the tears tracked down his weathered cheeks. "You're not going anywhere," he said roughly. "You're home." The camp transformed over the following weeks. The men grumbled at first about extra mouths to feed, but the children proved their worth quickly. Daniel, despite his small size, had his father's keen eye for timber and could spot which trees were ready for cutting. Ruth possessed their grandmother's gift with numbers, keeping track of board feet and calculating loads with accuracy that impressed even Jake. Sarah appointed herself camp entertainer, regaling the loggers with stories and songs that softened the hardest hearts. Thomas found himself studying their mannerisms, cataloging every gesture that echoed his lost brother. Daniel bit his lower lip when concentrating, just like their father had. Ruth hummed while she worked, the same tuneless melody their mother used to sing. Sarah had Daniel Sr.'s habit of tilting her head when listening, as if the world's secrets lived just slightly to the left. But it was the small kindnesses that sealed his heart completely. The way Daniel always saved the best portions of food for his sisters. How Ruth mended torn clothes without being asked. The way Sarah climbed into Thomas's lap during evening story times, as trusting as if she'd known him her whole short life. Winter arrived early that year, dropping 3 feet of snow in October and sealing the mountain passes until spring. The logging crew settled into the rhythm of maintenance work and indoor tasks. But Thomas hardly noticed the shortened days. His cabin, built for one lonely man, now rang with laughter and young voices planning Christmas surprises. On Christmas Eve, Daniel approached him with something wrapped in brown paper. "We found this in Pa's things," the boy said. "Ruth thought you might want it." Thomas unwrapped the package with careful hands, revealing a daguerreotype in a silver frame. The image showed 2 young men standing beside a half-built cabin, their faces serious, but their eyes bright with possibility. Thomas recognized himself at 22, his arm around Daniel at 18, both of them impossibly young and certain the world would bend to their will. On the back, in Daniel's familiar script, someone had written, "Tom and me, building the future, Montana Territory, 1847. "He kept this?" Thomas whispered. "Ma said he looked at it every night before bed." Ruth explained. "Said his brother was the strongest man in the world and someday we'd meet you." The frame trembled in Thomas's hands. Daniel had kept faith, even when Thomas had given up hope. Had treasured this photograph through years of separation and struggle, through marriage and fatherhood, and finally through the fever that claimed his life. Spring brought federal marshals to the valley, following reports of irregularities in the Fort Benton auction. Thomas met them at the camp's edge, flanked by Jake and his crew, the children safely tucked behind the cabin walls. "We're investigating the sale of 3 miners," the lead marshal announced, his badge catching the morning light. "Bills of sale show they were purchased by a Thomas Hartwell." "That's me." "These children were taken from their legal guardian without proper documentation. We're here to return them to their rightful caretaker." Thomas felt his world narrow to a sharp point. Their rightful caretaker is dead. They're orphans. Not according to this. The marshal produced an official-looking document. One Silas Creech filed papers claiming guardianship. Says he's been searching for them since they disappeared from Sacramento. Jake stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. Funny how this guardian just now shows up, months after the fact. The second marshal, younger and obviously nervous, cleared his throat. "Mr. Creech is prepared to compensate you for your trouble. Return the children, and this matter ends quietly." Thomas had heard of Silas Creech. Everyone in the territory had. A man who specialized in acquiring orphans for labor contracts, selling children to mines and factories that ground up young bodies for profit. The kind of predator who haunted auction houses looking for easy prey. "Where's your proof?" Thomas demanded. The lead marshal handed over a sheaf of papers. The guardianship documents looked official enough, complete with seals and signatures. But something felt wrong. Thomas studied them carefully, noting dates and locations. "This is dated 2 weeks ago," he said finally. "But it claims guardianship from last year." "Clerical error," the marshal said smoothly. "The important thing is the legal standing." Behind the cabin, Thomas heard the soft sound of a door closing. The children were listening, probably terrified they'd be dragged away from the only security they'd known since their parents died. "I want to see this Silas Creech," Thomas said. "He's waiting in town. Figured you might want to discuss terms." The ride to Whitefish took 2 hours through country Thomas knew like his own heartbeat. The marshals flanked him, professional and cold, while Jake and 3 of the crew followed at a distance. Thomas had left the children with Swede and Big Mike, both men armed and grimly determined to protect what they'd come to see as a family. Silas Creech waited in the Silver Dollar Saloon, a thin man with pale eyes and soft hands that had never done honest work. He smiled when Thomas entered, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Mr. Hartwell, I understand you've grown attached to my wards." "Your wards?" "3 children placed in my care by the California territorial authorities. I've been searching for them ever since they were illegally sold at auction." Thomas pulled out a chair and sat down across from Creech, noting how the man's fingers drummed nervously on the scarred table. Behind him, the marshals positioned themselves near the bar, hands near their weapons. "Tell me about them," Thomas said quietly. "Excuse me?" "The children. If they're your wards, you must know them well. Tell me their names." Creech's smile flickered. "Daniel, Ruth, and Sarah. Good children, despite their circumstances." "What circumstances?" "Their father was a wastrel who died of drink. Mother was a saloon girl who took fever. Tragic, really." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression carefully neutral. "You sure about that?" "Of course I'm sure. I have all the documentation." "Including their birth certificates?" Creech produced more papers with a flourish. "Everything is in order, I assure you." Thomas examined the documents, his heart sinking. They looked authentic, complete with official seals and witness signatures. But something nagged at him, some detail that didn't align. Then he saw it. The birth certificate for Sarah showed her birth year as 1857, making her 8 years old. But Thomas had spent months with the child, celebrating her 7th birthday just 2 weeks ago. The date was wrong by a full year. "This says Sarah is 8, Thomas said carefully. "Yes, small for her age." "When's her birthday?" Creech consulted his papers. "March 15th. Thomas nodded slowly. Sarah's actual birthday was January 3rd. She told him the story of being born during a blizzard that trapped the midwife for 3 days. "And Ruth?" 11 years old, born July 22nd. Ruth was 10, born September 1st. Thomas remembered the story clearly because she'd been born during the first gold rush, when Daniel Sr. was still convinced he'd strike it rich. These weren't just clerical errors. They were fabrications. "I want to hear from the children themselves," Thomas said. "That's not necessary," one of the marshals interjected. "The documentation is clear. The law requires proper identification of minors," Thomas countered, drawing on knowledge gained from his early days as a territorial magistrate. "I have the right to verify these are the children in question." Creech's smile turned predatory. "You're delaying the inevitable, Mr. Hartwell. These children belong with their legal guardian. Then they won't mind proving it." The standoff stretched until the saloon door opened and Jake entered with the 3 children in tow. Thomas's heart clenched at their frightened faces, but he'd had no choice. This was the only way to expose Creech's deception. "Sarah," Creech said smoothly, "come to your Uncle Silas." The little girl pressed closer to Thomas's side, confusion clear in her green eyes. "I don't know you, mister." "Of course you do, dear. I took care of you after your parents died." "No," Sarah said firmly. "Uncle Thomas took care of us. You're a stranger." Creech's composure cracked slightly. "Children often forget traumatic events. It's natural." "What's my birthday?" Ruth asked suddenly. "July 22nd, Creech replied without hesitation. "Wrong." Ruth's voice carried steel that reminded Thomas of his brother's stubborn streak. "It's September 1st. I was born during the gold rush, and Pa used to joke that I was his real treasure." The marshals exchanged glances, doubt creeping into their expressions. "And mine?" Daniel challenged. Creech consulted his papers. "October 10th. "November 25th, Daniel said quietly. "Same day as Grandpa Hartwell. Ma said it was like having Grandpa's spirit return to the family." Thomas felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. The lead marshal stepped forward, his hand moving to his gun, not in threat, but in preparation. "Mr. Creech," the marshal said slowly, "these discrepancies are troubling." "Children lie," Creech snapped. "They've been coached by this lumber baron to protect his investment." "What investment?" Thomas asked. "Child labor. Everyone knows logging camps use youngsters for dangerous work. You bought them to replace the men you can't afford to hire." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Thomas felt the eyes of everyone in the saloon measuring him, wondering if there was truth in Creech's words. Then Sarah stepped forward, her small chin raised in defiance. "Uncle Thomas doesn't make us work dangerous jobs," she declared. "He teaches us letters and numbers. He reads us stories every night. He hugs us when we have bad dreams. And he cries sometimes," Ruth added softly, "when he thinks we can't see. But they're happy tears, 'cause he says we look like his brother who went away." The saloon fell silent, except for the tick of a clock and the distant sound of horses in the street. "His brother?" the younger marshal asked. "Our pa," Daniel explained. "Daniel Hartwell. He used to tell us about Uncle Thomas all the time, how they built a cabin together when they were young, how Thomas could fell a tree faster than any man in the territory." Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew the daguerreotype the children had given him at Christmas. He placed it on the table where everyone could see. "My brother Daniel and me," he said quietly. 1847. He ran off to California chasing gold, and I never saw him again. But he kept this picture for 15 years, and his children remember the stories he told. The lead marshal picked up the photograph, studying the two young faces. The resemblance between Thomas and the children was unmistakable now that everyone was looking for it. "These are your brother's children?" "Yes. And this man," Thomas gestured at Creech, "is trying to steal them based on forged documents." Creech was already moving toward the back door when the younger marshal grabbed his arm. "I don't think so." The investigation that followed revealed a network of fraud stretching from California to Montana. Creech had been filing false guardianship claims across the territories, intercepting orphan trains and auction sales to acquire children for labor contracts. The real tragedy was how many families he'd separated before Thomas and the children exposed his scheme. Summer returned to the logging camp with the sound of young laughter echoing through the pines. Thomas officially adopted his nieces and nephew, though the legal papers only confirmed what everyone already knew. They were family, bound by blood and choice, and the stubborn love that had kept Daniel Sr. treasuring a photograph for 15 years. The children thrived in the mountain air. Daniel grew strong, helping with the lighter logging work, his natural eye for timber earning respect from the crew. Ruth took over the camp's bookkeeping, her mathematical gifts keeping their operation profitable even in lean years. Sarah became the camp's unofficial mascot, her stories and songs brightening the hardest days. On quiet evenings, Thomas would sit on his porch watching the children play in the meadow beside Crow Creek, their voices mixing with the sound of water over stones. Sometimes he thought about the twists of fate that had brought them together. A desperate auction, a risky bid, the cruel machinations of a man like Creech. But mostly he thought about Daniel, and the brother who'd kept faith across years and miles and silence. In these children, Thomas had found not just family, but redemption for all the words left unsaid and chances left untaken. The daguerreotype sat on the mantel now, restored to a place of honor. Sometimes Thomas caught the children studying it, tracing the faces of the two young men who dreamed of building something lasting in the wilderness. They'd succeeded in ways neither brother could have imagined. As autumn painted the mountainsides gold and red, Thomas began planning additions to the cabin. More bedrooms, a larger kitchen, maybe a schoolroom where Ruth could teach the younger children of nearby homesteads. The camp was changing, growing from a rough logging operation into something more permanent, more like home. Winter would come again, sealing them into their mountain valley with snow and silence. But this time Thomas wouldn't spend the long nights alone with his regrets. He'd have stories to tell and lessons to teach, laughter to share and memories to build. The children had brought more than family to his isolated world. They'd brought hope and the promise that sometimes the most precious things come disguised as desperate choices at dusty auctions in forgotten towns. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow and the sound of children's voices calling him to dinner. Thomas Hartwell smiled and headed inside. No longer the lonely lumberjack who'd bid $50 on 3 orphans with sacks over their heads. He was a father now, and uncle, and the keeper of his brother's deepest trust. Don't forget to subscribe and consider giving a like to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.